Welcome everyone to the first chapter of REN-SHEN Half Spirit. Book 1, The Quickening. A thought became a roar. The early years, chapter 1. Steve Nedelkin always seemed a little older than he actually was. He physically matured early and had an intellectual maturity which older people would always embrace. Perhaps it was due to the fact he lost his mother when he was just 6 years of age. It wasn't long before young Steve was doing the necessary tasks around the house for both his father and himself. He enjoyed reading, exercise, and absolutely loved playing his guitar. Born in Adelaide, Australia, the son of Macedonian immigrants who left poverty and a civil war behind in what is now part of Greece, Steve was always taught to be proud of his Macedonian heritage. "We Macedonians ruled the world," his father would sometimes say. He'd often remind Steve that his family used to be important once upon a time and say, "Even the mountains used to have our name." Of course, none of that made a great deal of sense to Steve because his people arrived in Australia penniless and worked as labourers for most of their lives. They only sought to measure themselves against their fellow immigrants, and the suffering they endured from their endless toil seemed a badge of merit. Watching relatives compare employment-related injuries seemed very peculiar to him. His father was a lion of a man with immense strength and enormous capacity to explode with a rage which others would fear. Steve vividly recalled seeing his father's violent nature when a local gangster made an uninvited entrance to a function held by his local Macedonian community. While most of the community members didn't want any trouble, Steve's father couldn't bear watching the criminal try and intimidate his family and friends. The tough guy was removed from the community hall by the scruff of his neck. When he tried to square up and fight Steve's father, he was rewarded with a backhanded slap across his face. The kind which only a strong man who worked with his hands all his life could deliver. After he picked himself up off the ground, the gangster sprinted away to safety, never to be seen again. As a young child, Steve quickly learned how his father's demeanour changed around what he called spioni, or spies. Those people were treated with caution and a sense of trepidation by his father. The spioni were the people from the same region back in the old country. They had ties to the new Greek government. They had the potential to make life a permanent misery for any relatives back home if there was any indication of Macedonian patriotism, enthusiastically displayed in his warmly embraced new country. Words and actions were always measured carefully in the company of these people. The hidden agendas and purposeful double meanings conveyed in such meetings were often a source of intrigue for a young Steve, who quickly learned to read between the lines. School was pleasant enough for Steve. He had an uncanny ability to quickly grasp concepts and easily maintain a solid B+ average. He certainly wasn't the smartest in the class, but nobody doubted he could have given some of the brilliant students' minds a run for their money if only he pursued anything academic with real vigour. A constant theme in his report cards was the potential, the potential, the potential. He played numerous team sports, yet didn't particularly excel. He didn't seem to enjoy the actual games very much, and always wondered if he should enter the fray at the expense of another team member. All of the sports were about chasing after a ball, and quite frankly, it didn't go unnoticed his pet dog Rover enjoyed chasing balls far more and would have been infinitely more up to the task. Nevertheless, Steve did enjoy the social interactions, and the numerous sports allowed him to move effortlessly between a number of school cliques. One notable event occurred at an Australian rules football training session when Steve was 15 years old. The team was playing a game called Red Rover All Over. They were split into two teams, with one team halfway along the football field and the other level with the goals. The other team had to run and tackle Steve and his teammates and drag them to the ground. One of the faster boys managed to grab Steve and try to wrestle him to the ground. He did everything right. His arms managed to wrap around Steve with particular attention to his centre of gravity. He dropped and tried to drag Steve down with all his might. Much to his dismay, he was flung off Steve as though electrocuted. This prompted others to attempt the seemingly inevitable takedown. The first few were rejected in a similar manner. Then finally all of the opposition managed to lay a hand on Steve, yet he couldn't be dragged down. Hilariously, the entire team then attempted to drag him down and they simply couldn't do it, no matter what they attempted. Steve glanced at the coach, who couldn't understand what kind of crazy force was stopping his very average team player from being dragged to the ground. Everyone other than Steve was perplexed. The physics was quite logical to Steve. In fact, the entire team pushing and pulling in every direction created a hedge of sorts. All of their frenzied physicality and desperation was there to be utilised. And Steve let them all help. They helped him stand upright amongst it all. Steve was rather nonplussed by the event, yet his colleagues seemed to treat him differently from that time on. It was simple and logical to him. The right kind of angle, of deflection, a twist, a push, and people could be controlled physically. One of his friends suggested he should develop his natural abilities further and join a nearby karate school. It was 1985, and the film Karate Kid had been released a year earlier to huge box office success. Karate had enjoyed a phenomenal resurgence in popularity and finally managed to claim the crown from Kung Fu, which legendary Bruce Lee single-handedly made famous in the 1970s. The instructor, Sensei Mike Ferguson, was an ex-Vietnam Army veteran. He was incredibly strong, a tall man with long red hair and what seemed a tattoo for every occasion, painted over the exposed areas of his body. Long before tattoos were a necessary fashion accessory for the modern millennial, the tattoos seemed to tell a story as they wound around his muscular frame. A glimpse of a phoenix, a snake, a dragon, a fish, all of them oriental in design. Not even a hint of bawdy sailor's tattoo on the huge man. The tattoos were impeccably done and only added to the mystique of Steve's second mentor. His first mentor was clearly his father. Sensei Mike would command attention by his mere presence, and all classes were conducted in Japanese. There was no choice. Not a single word was uttered in English. The language transformed Sensei Mike as soon as he stepped into the dojo and commanded his students. His energy infused everyone in the room. The Okinawan Japanese is regarded as a dialect and is constantly changing as it slowly continues to transform into the standard modern Japanese language. Sometimes Sensei would use the more archaic Okinawan words, usually reserved for the elders in Okinawa. Steve's enthusiasm for his karate extended to embracing the languages immediately. It would prove to be extremely useful in the near future. In the early 1970s, Sensei Mike felt abandoned by Australia. The Vietnam veterans never received the appreciation and reverence that other returned war veterans received in earlier wars. In fact, they were often despised by the younger generations for their participation in what they believed to be an unjust war. He left his home country and moved to Okinawa, where he quickly recommenced his training in karate that had been abruptly curtailed by the Vietnam War. The style of karate was Goju-Ryu and was popular in the region. It was formalized over 2 generations under the eager and competent minds of the likes of Higeonna Kanryo and subsequently the spiritual founder Chojun Miyagi. Sensei Mike was hardened by the war but found comfort in dedicating himself to his training. In the 10 years he was in Okinawa, he managed to impress his masters with his ferocious strength and understanding of the complexities of the softer forms of the art. He earned his Godan, or 5th Dan level of black belt, in record time, and was well known in many circles for his fierce combat style. However, events he was reluctant to describe forced him to flee his beloved and idyllic Okinawa and return to Australia. Steve was enormously parochial about his martial arts style. No other martial art could be better than Goju-Ryu, and no other instructor could possibly be better than Sensei Mike. Though it wasn't too long before Steve learned how the great founders had each travelled to China to learn such exotic Chinese styles such as Luohan and White Crane, how inextricably linked Goju-Ryu was to the southern Shaolin Kung Fu styles. Indeed, many Goju-Ryu katas would exhibit the Chinese influence with their hard and soft movements. These distinguishing features were often more akin to the Shaolin Kung Fu styles than other contemporary karate styles. The training felt glorious to Steve. There was no room for doubt about what he had to do and no waiting for other team players to have his turn. He was blessed with strength and coordination and was man-sized at 15 years of age and close to 6 feet tall. The training comprised excellent body conditioning and strengthening exercises. Flexibility came quickly, and practice was infinitely rewarding. While students often had to train for years before they were even allowed to train the Sanchin kata in the most traditional dojos, Steve left his sensei no choice. He was allowed to begin learning in after 2 months. He'd done everything asked of him and excelled. It was as though every essence of his being was created for the purpose of karate. Sensei Mike would say, Sanchin means 3 battles. And I understand this is a battle to unify the mind, body, and spirit. The untrained eye sees the Sanchin kata as a sequence of extremely slow movements, combined with a look of intense determination. Don't kid yourself. It's a battle on all fronts. The entire body anticipates every defense and attack, and the mind, body, and spirit combine to create the perfect technique. It anticipates, it readies, it absorbs, it breathes, it lives. It sees and hears and smells and senses everything that is happening and is yet to happen. It is a meditative form of combat that only the mind's eye can see, yet it manifests itself in such a way that an average person sees nothing particularly remarkable. Make no mistake, the essence of a man, his soul or spirit or reason for existence can be crushed with this kata's intent and fervour. Steve understood the intent of Sanchin, as a baby knows to suckle the breast of its mother. It was natural. It was the only way, and any other way was indirect and futile. It simply made perfect sense to Steve, and he was of the resolute belief he was born for this. Some students never fully mastered the Sanchin. It was the alpha and omega. Steve's form was faultless within 6 months. Sensei Mike knew he had found someone special in Steve who was worthy and who would honour the style. Naturally good students were good advertising for Sensei Mike, and he needed every dollar after returning penniless from Japan. Classes continued to grow, and it wasn't long before Steve was teaching some sessions and demonstrating his outstanding, remarkable martial skills. 2 years later, Steve was awarded black belt status. His ability demanded the acknowledgement of the black belt, and his respect and admiration and servitude to his sensei made it a pleasure for Sensei Mike to bestow the honour on his prized student. Within record time, most importantly, Steve had earned the respect from his hero, his sensei. At 17 years of age, Steve had few peers who were able to match his fighting prowess. The way he embraced his katas allowed him to transcend the normal instinctual reactions most people respond to in violent situations. Steve understood the only true enemy was himself, and it was essential to be able to harness every aspect of his being to make the complete fighter he so wanted to be. Sensei Mike was the only fighter whom Steve could spar with and be challenged by with every move. Steve had a repertoire of moves which would always work without fail with lesser adversaries, but Sensei Mike typically had an answer for every one of Steve's moves. On the rare occasion Steve managed to find a way past the fearsome guard of Sensei Mike, the sheer elation of the win would end up being a Pyrrhic victory, as it would distract Steve for a microsecond before Sensei Mike returned the favour tenfold. The little wins for Steve began to grow into more frequent occurrences, and the joy from Sensei Mike was obvious. His protege was getting very close to being as fully trained by Sensei Mike as possible. Only further tuition in Okinawa under the great masters would help Steve realise his full potential to become a Goju-Ryu master. Sensei Mike knew Steve would honour him and stay with his dojo forever if necessary. Such was their bond and Steve's dedication. But he saw so much potential in Steve and wanted to see how far this young man could go. He saw greatness in the young Macedonian warrior. Sensei Mike wanted to see how Steve would progress with a life free from the pain and suffering he himself had endured. He believed it would allow Steve to flourish and become one of the most enlightened masters in the style of Goju-Ryu. But first, there was one thing: a tournament. Steve needed to take away someone else's right to win. He needed to take it from them. He would learn that things a man dreams of sometimes comes at untold cost. Well, friends, that was chapter 1. What did we learn? There were a few points that you might remember from that little bit of excitement I just read out. Clearly we were training some Goju-Ryu. We were hearing about spies. Were spies a thing in Greece? We mentioned the Greek Civil War. The Greeks describe it, and you'll read about it, as a war between the communists and the royalists. In fact, there were Macedonians there. These people were a distinct ethnicity, quite different from what you'll see as modern Greeks. For one, the Macedonian language is completely different from Greek. It shares similarities with neighbouring languages in Serbia, Bulgaria, and further afar. There's a reason why the Macedonians sided with the communists. The communists promised the Macedonians that they would have independence if they fought for them. They didn't care. The communists couldn't care less who was running what part of the region, as long as the communist ideals were promoted. So there were a number of people that fought who weren't communists, but who were looking for their own self-determination as Macedonians, as ethnic Macedonians. So many Macedonians became partisans. They wanted to fight for their independence. The spies? Well, imagine if China took over the United States and insisted everyone started speaking Chinese. And your best friend who lived next door to you started speaking Chinese. And he spoke to you in Chinese. You grew up together. You were like bros from way back. And here's your best bro speaking Chinese to you. And you're kind of looking at him a bit funny and saying, are you for real here? Is everything normal? But he was. And then furthermore, he'd report you to the authorities because you were still speaking English. Well, that was the case in what's northern Greece nowadays, where from the 1920s, they had a process of just removing any trace of the Macedonian ethnicity. You'd be rewarded with having to drink castor oil, or thrown in jail, or tortured. This was before the Civil War. When you got to the Civil War, well then other things happened, and we might read a bit about that later on, but it's not important for now. Now, Okinawan karate, how interesting. If you actually look at a map, you'll realize Okinawa is pretty much in between what we consider Japan. We think of Tokyo, that group of islands, and China, mainland China, the People's Republic of China. So you've got the Ryukyu Islands. We'll keep going with Okinawa. You've got Okinawa pretty much right in between. The influences from China, even the name of the people, the Ryukyu, comes from China. China was heavily connected to these people. So when it came time for some people to learn martial arts, from Okinawa, they actually went to China and trained with some of the Kung Fu masters. The closest part of China, of mainland China to Okinawa, was the Fujian province. Fujian is the home of Southern Shaolin Kung Fu. So to learn the Fujian styles would not have been an outrageous thought. So quite amazing for me, teaching a Kung Fu style and then seeing the Sanchin kata, which is a sequence of movements, and they look very similar. There are differences. We'll talk about them, but similar movements. You know, they all came from the same place. So that's quite curious and interesting. Two different paths, of course. You'll find karate is typically a strong, very hard sort of style, and you'll see Kung Fu looking quite flowery in comparison. The best description I've ever heard of comparing the two styles is that karate is a steel bar that is hitting you, whereas Kung Fu is a steel ball on the end of a chain. The steel ball on the end of a chain implies a certain looseness until that last minute. Well, I'm going to let you in on another big secret in this world. A good karate practitioner can be loose right up to that last moment. So this is not about who's better. It's about understanding what needs to be done in combat. So you can be good from anywhere as long as you practice and understand and think about it. A master truly understands there's only one way to do it. So their path might have been completely different. They might have actually approached it from two different ways, the steel bar versus the steel ball on the end of a chain. But by the time they get to the end, by the time they actually understand what they're trying to achieve, they know they need the strike to be everything. So Steve Nedelkin has just figured out he's about to fight in a tournament. He's going to be very excited. He's going to be very motivated. We know all this. I'm sure anyone who's competed in their lives would have had the same feelings. Stay tuned for next chapter. It's going to be quite interesting. Please subscribe. Chapter 2 is next. I look forward to seeing you all here. Ring the bell so you're reminded precisely when the next video is available. The book is available. If you're listening to me talking and reading through the chapters and it is boring you to tears, please buy the book and still watch the video anyway. You're starting to hear a few little extra bits and pieces. I'm hoping we're going to continue with this. I'm very confident I'm going to continue with it. I'm hoping you continue with this. So please stay tuned, stay involved and interact. Feel free to ask some questions. Thank you so much.